The Ethnic History of South Carolina, South Carolina's Contribution to the American History is the latest book written by historian and former Charleston County School Board chairwoman, principal, and teacher Liz Alston. I sit down one-on-one with Liz for this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and download my free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Elizabeth Alston, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Quintin, it's been a while. How are you?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I know you are very popular these days and always have been. But you have a new book out now that's called The Ethnic History of South Carolina, South Carolina's Contribution to American History.
Yeah, it's a labor of love. I wrote it when I was, working for the school district,
right.
And it sat idle for a number of years. And since I have been on speaking engagements, a lot of people have been asking about it. So got my legal representation, and with the help of the people at Grace Cathedral,
right.
The book was published under my name. So I'm very happy that South Carolinians are able to look at the history. And I was the ethnic coordinator for the school district some years ago, and we studied the ethnic identities of 7 minority groups in South Carolina. In addition to African Americans, we've discussed the Greeks. We talk about the French Huguenots, the Germans.
Right.
We talked about the American Indians.
Sure.
And all of those ethnic groups in South Carolina. And the book cover actually lists the groups that are identified. Some people said, well, you only pictured young people. But according to all of these areas, and certainly the Jewish Americans as well.
Sure.
So I spent an inordinate amount of time traveling to various sections of South Carolina and doing workshops about these groups. So at least now it's in the public arena.
When you were traveling around South Carolina, what county describes you as a history teacher?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was a history teacher, taught the first Black history course in Charleston County and at Trinity Tech.
Right.
So I taught just about every social studies history course in South Carolina. Of course, I taught American history.
Right.
11th grade, I taught citizenship. I taught European history. I taught geography and all of the areas. And of course, the 2 schools that I taught are now no longer with us.
Right.
Gentrification, I would imagine, took care of Shakora High School and Barnes Wilson High School.
Okay. What schools in Charleston County today would benefit from this particular book?
I think all. I met with Janita Postlethwaite.
Oh, yeah.
To find out, that if it's taught, because there are laws about it. I saw in the paper day before yesterday, I think it's Wagner, some representative, talking about making sure that it's there. When I was working for the school district as the social studies consultant, I would visit schools, and it was our jobs to field test this in the schools. So since I have left, I cannot say what is being taught. I'm sure that the school textbook committees and curriculum coordinators, that they would make sure that diversity is a part of the curriculum. The State Department mandates it, so I would just err on the side of caution and said that the laws are being followed.
And I want to reread what you, obviously the title of your book, The Ethnic History of South Carolina, South Carolina's Contribution to American History. What has that contribution been, Ms. Alston?
Well, how much time do you have? Well, which means that over the past couple of years, certainly with the election of Barack Obama,
Sure.
that there have been serious efforts to make sure that the history of all people are taught. And the last time I look at the laws, that they were supposed to be done, but a lot of people are still concerned about the history, not only of African Americans, but Greeks, as I mentioned,
Right.
and the 7 ethnic groups that populated South Carolina. Sometimes when I'm talking about this, a question from the audience was, well, Ms. Alston, what about the Chinese? I said, are you talking about one of the 5 great powers of the world? So, which means that the Chinese influence in America, or at least in South Carolina at the beginning,
Right.
was probably minimal. But those were the major groups that populated South Carolina. And I still visit schools, particularly during this month, which
Right.
is Black History Month,
Sure.
and to highlight the achievements. But there have been many teachers, social studies teachers and others, who have made serious efforts to make sure that our diversity is celebrated not only in the marketplace and the economic scene, but in the classroom.
In the classroom. And I was reading just last night, obviously, due to the book, and I read the preface, and you basically said the results or benefits expected from the study are as follows. This to stimulate interest and concern regarding human rights. What is the state of human rights right now?
Well, everybody asked me that particular question, and I must admit, as I was at a workshop, well, I have a view of Schopenhauer, Emerson, and Kant. Until the Americans, not only as African Americans, have a full place at the table, as long as the representation of the state reflects the actual population, or the textbooks that are in the schools reflects the contributions of all of the groups who have contributed to it. Until the rights of all South Carolinians, Charlestonians, and Americans are representative. So which means that so that we would not need a police chief, maybe like Reginald Burgess, to make sure that all of these things are done. You could read the paper each day about the injustices that are perpetrated against people, or police chiefs around the state who have probably violated the rights of others, or police, every time I pick up my phone, there's a police chief in this section of the country that violated, or someone is being dragged. And unfortunately, 9 times out of 10, the victims are African American. I read on Sunday's paper about a young man who was 13 years old, was charged with a crime, and whether or not justice was served, certainly in the eyes of Liz Alston it wasn't. And he died a couple of months ago, and his family still trying to prove his innocence. So there are too many instances of injustices that prevail for me to be comfortable with the status quo.
And it also goes on to say this, obviously, you said this too, to produce positive human relationships between culturally diverse groups. What are those culturally diverse groups now in your mind?
Well, the same groups that I'm talking about.
Okay.
You find that in Americans, a lot of person talks about blacks and Latinos, or is the justice system actually deals fairly with them. I attend a number of conferences, and these topics come up over and over again about, is there dialogue between the various groups? Say maybe if we were talking about the areas in Charleston or Charleston County or the Tri-County areas, is there dialogue between the groups? There has been Judo-ethnic relations between the Jewish population. The Greeks, to a degree, may have been assimilated into the culture. The Germans, and I'm just zeroing in on the groups that I've studied over the years.
Sure.
Are the American Indians, are they assimilated into American culture? I guess it would depend on who you're talking about. There has been so many efforts, with the ministerial alliances, the mayors who have gotten into it. There have been diversity coordinators that have been hired, not only at, say, if maybe at the College of Charleston, at the Medical University of South Carolina, at the University of South Carolina. The city of Charleston just hired a diversity coordinator.
Sure.
So, which means that it's 2020, and these things have just been done in the last couple of years. Then it shows you that we have come a long way, but to use the old cliche, we still have a long way to go.
How far do you have to go when it comes to this subject?
Now, there you go again, Quintin. And I said that, South Carolina, say maybe, okay, let's say, just look at Charleston County.
Okay.
I'll sweep in front of my own door.
Okay.
Has Charleston ever had a black mayor? Not Pleasant. Has they ever had a black mayor? Or North Charleston, even though they have been sporadic attempts whereby other than minority persons have applied for these jobs. Or if you look at the composition of the state delegation, we do have minority representation in the state house. Or if we look at the composition of the state races, maybe the constitutional offices, Secretary of State, if you had a lieutenant governor or a governor. So when diversity has infiltrated a number of these offices that I have mentioned, it would be good. The school board, if we're talking about minority representative, the school board has in the past reflected some degree of diversity. Right now you have, 3 or 4 members of the school board, but there is an effort to overhaul and to have single member districts rather than the school board being elected countywide. So there are always efforts to do better based upon the constituents who are dissatisfied with the status quo.
Elizabeth Alston, chairwoman of the Charleston County School Board many, many years ago. If you were in this position today, where would you be?
Well, which means that I sometimes have a reluctance to say that I've taken along a lot of strong stances over the years. Certainly, we are not satisfied with the way things are. I have not sat down with Leon Stavronakis, who has proposed this bill, and I saw in today's paper that the parents are up in arms about it. So I think I'm going to take a wait and see attitude to see what the public wants. As long as all of the students are being treated fairly in the school, as long as the representation reflects the population makeup. And I believe in majority rule. So whatever the majority wants and the input of the public is something that I would be satisfied with.
And let me get back to the other objectives here for this particular book. To promote recognition of the contributions of all cultural minorities to the growth of the state and the nation. What have those contributions been thus far in your mind?
Well, there have been a lot of contributions, but many of them have not been, at the forefront. We've had some recognition, say maybe the Septima Club.
Oh, yeah.
Passageway or the crosstown route that has been named. As I walk around the city of Charleston, right by the parking garage, you would see a representation of Jonathan Jasper Wright.
Right.
Or you could see some of the schools that have been named in honor of people like the Philip Simmons School.
Right.
Throughout on Daniel Island and at the campus at Burke. But at the same time, you find that because of gentrification, so many of our citizens, say maybe in the city of Charleston, has been diluted. And so you don't find many people living, and sometimes being an historian, I would walk down the streets to see how many of them are named for minorities. And I guess I have a tendency, rather than talking global wide, since we're talking about South Carolina. Uh, South Carolina is moving up, but I feel that our progress has been stymied, by discrimination to a very large degree. I see, since the shooting of the 9 people at Emmanuel, one of the things that has brought comfort to my soul is that there have been a number of groups of people who are getting together to talk about racial reconciliation. City Council passed a law about apologizing for slavery, and that probably brings up a lot of controversy about it, because I sit in groups and people will say they don't have anything to apologize for. Well, I have a 2-page argument that I could talk about that. But there have been groups that get together at numerous churches that have symposium on racial reconciliation. Then there are pastors in the pulpit who says that when you're talking about reconciliation, that we have not reconciled, that it's conciliation. And City Council also passed a resolution, or it wasn't a law, about talking about that first we have to reconcile about it. So at least the conversations are still continuing. And I am heartened about that. Or say maybe I have, aside from my own church, have a real dearth of love and admiration and respect for Grace Episcopal Church on Wentworth Street. And there have been others talking about books. And then there is a plethora of books talking about racial conciliation. The Soul of America by John Meacham. We are now discussing the book White Fragility, that talks about why white people don't like to talk about race. There was another book, Dear Martin. You find out that by Nick Stone, who talks about these areas. So maybe from one person's perspective, racial discussions are still going on. There are so many groups, and I hate to just not having a list of them, because like another group that gets together is the transitional table, whereby you have a group of persons of diverse cultures who will have dinner to bring together people to talk about race. And in my limited association with people, I have found that the conscience of whites have been raised. Many people talk about the fact that they are just not aware of many of the trials and tribulations that ethnic minorities have faced. And many of them are coming to grips with it, and they are having discussions around the state. Depending on who you would talk about, you could talk about the conviction rate of people who commit hate crimes. Does South Carolina have a hate crime bill? There are bills talking about ending, violence in schools. So, which means that the discussion that goes on, I could mention all of these things that in 2020 that are unresolved, but at least there is a concentrated, conscious effort about people who try to do something about it. And reaching back into history, talking about it's in 2015, being a member of Emmanuel, the removal of the Confederate flag. you find out that it happened in 2015. So which means that like 4 years ago. So because of the efforts of many of the politicians, so Nikki Haley is given the credit, but there have been conscious efforts over the years for the removal of the flag. If you're going to ask questions about the races, what about the removal of Confederate monuments around the state or around the country?
Sure.
Certainly, a monument that causes interest is the Calhoun statue on Calhoun Street. And there's a committee of people who talk about it. And I think it was the current mayor who says more information might be added. And of course, rather than renaming Calhoun Street, which in my opinion will cause World War III, that you have, and it was Dudley Gregory, who was a member of Emmanuel and who is a city council member, who had the block called Mother Emanuel Memorial Way.
Right.
So if you're going to talk about, and I won't be judgmental to say that there have been a number of efforts, but there have been a few efforts at conciliation, not reconciliation, because we have not yet reconciled. And I could go around the country because I spend 50% of my day reading papers, talking to people, going to conferences, serving on committees, running my mouth, as I usually do, about these kinds of issues. But I feel that the Ethnic History of South Carolina, a book that has been written some time ago, that would at least reflect on the contributions that have been made. And this is not new information.
Okay.
It's just that it's coming to the aid of the public. Hopefully it will be in the county library, in the bookstores, because I consider myself a one-woman army to make sure at least that our history is at least available for those persons who need to be aware of our contributions.
And you also say, to improve the self-image of ethnic groups. What is that self-image now?
Well, here again is, my opinion, and I was just reading in today's paper, and I think that someone said that, and an opinion is just one person's will to talk about things without information. So when you talk about my opinion, at least I try to have facts set with it. But you talk about self-image. Kenneth Clark and a lot of psychologists or psychiatrists will say that one's self-identity or self-image is reflected is how one feels about himself.
Okay.
If you go to school and none of the contributions of your ancestors is reflected in the history, then a lot of psychiatrists say that lowers one's self-image. And as old as I am, if I would go to a meeting and the first thing that I would glance around the room to see how many people that looks like me in the room, or if I go to a board meeting and see that the composition of the presenters don't look like me, and so right away I have a friend who will say, "Yeah, you said this." If I know who I'm talking about. I have a friend who saying, who questions my self-image. And I said, well, I don't feel good because I don't see anybody looking like me. So, yes, that's that's probably one person's view on self-image. Because if my history is not reflected in the textbooks, or that if I go into a store and I don't see any clerks that looks like me, or then yes, my mind and my self-image is impaired. So I could imagine the little 6-year-olds and They talk about dolls, and so now when I go to stores, I will see dolls of various cultural images. And so, yes, it goes back because I do feel that every aspect of our life should be reflected in some positive way about the diverse communities that comprise this great nation of ours.
And you also want to provide insight into the life of an immigrant who arrived in America and South Carolina during the early stages of our history. Who is that immigrant?
Well, as I said, these same people that we talk about. We're talking about the Jewish people that came from various sections of Europe and Asia and around the world. Or if you can talk about the French Huguenots, or if you're talking about the Germans, if you're talking about the Greeks, and then you're talking about the African Americans. Well, of course, the American Indians were here when a lot of these people come. So when we're talking about the ethnic history and the immigrants, and of course now the pot has been stirred because all of the immigrants that have been coming in, the restrictions that have been placed on them. And South Carolina has seen a trickle of many of these immigrants, particularly from the Latin American countries and for other countries south of the border that all of the consternation is about. So yes, so immigration is still a problem, whether or not they are sent back, whether or not they are allowed to vote. So, which means that we were all immigrants, with the exception of certainly the Indians came from someplace else. But the image on the newspapers and what's happening today is a reflection of our history. And the United States has we have a foreign policy that does many of these things. Rules are still being made about certain areas. People are still going around talking about many of these things. Sometimes I get called from around the nation and they said, well, many of the people, like gun violence is an issue. I got a friend in Gaffney and she was saying, Miss Alston, there was a lady who was talking about gun violence. And I found out that she was talking about Sharon Risher, who was the daughter of Ethel Lance. So there are so many of us who are going around still fighting for equalization, who are fighting for justice at the terms of injustice. So all of those things. And I still make speeches, and I'm making one, and I'm going to talk about courage. And I think it takes courage for those of us who may have had some semblances of accountability, or to fight for those people who still have not achieved full areas. I'm talking about, the children. I'm talking about our black men who are still being arrested at an alarming rate, and I'm going to use that word alarming, and for the immigrants that are denied entrance into a fair section of our country. And we can talking about even women who are still going through the glass ceiling. So there are many areas when we talk about full acceptance in many instances. So here we go.
And that brings me to my next question, to examine some of the problems that concern today's minority groups. What are those other problems?
Well, I'm saying is that when you pick up the paper, you will find out that, voting. And I was just reading in the paper the other day when it rains that a lot of us vote. We had to have the 1964 and 1965 Voting Rights Act, even though the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, 1865, 1870, the right to vote, and the 14th Amendment. So those issues, that the right to vote is still being challenged by a lot of Americans. The right of, free assembly is already there. But I'm saying is that incarceration at high rates is still a problem. So there are a number of problems, and I feel that if our history is presented in a manner being taught in our schools that reflect the racial diversity of this great country of ours, then that understanding will go a long way. And I see that even today, that people still do not know our history and therefore don't recognize our contributions. And so it caused a lessening of knowledge and self-esteem in our culture.
And you also said this too, to identify the ethnic contributions made by South Carolinians to the richness of American society. Who are those South Carolinians?
Well, here again, you don't have all day, but I'm saying that when you talk about South Carolinians around the country, I think about not only from the military part, Webster, and I think about Septima Clark here, and I think about Majeska Monteith Simpkins in Columbia and the efforts that she has made, or many of the people around the country who've come to South Carolina. Thurgood Marshall, the first person on the African American on the Supreme Court, or the women on the Supreme Court. So we could just go on down the line. Sometimes I travel around. How many streets are named for people? The Ronnie Hamilton building in the North area that's named for him. Or, like I said, I have a real penchant for Septima Clark. And I have Esau Jenkins from the islands. And then there are a lot of the younger ones who are going on, other South Carolinians, like our own Congressman Jim Clyburn from Sumter, South Carolina. And so that there have been spot checks of South Carolinians that have made it. Talking about the East Side there, and of course you're from the East Side, and the buildings that are named for them. But one of the things, Quintin, I think that this is something. Are there any streets on the East Side that is aside, named, for? There's a Philip Simmons statue in Hempstead Square. But a lot of the streets, if we look at streets that are named from the East Side, you have America Street, you have Columbus Street named after Columbus, you have all of these other streets which means that the composition of the East Side is now changing. So you find that, which means that not only is it changing, but at the same time that the problems that are still very much evident in many of these areas. If you look at the schools on the East Side, I think the only school that I know over there that's named is probably Wilmot Frazier, who was a black superintendent of education in the area. But even Burke High School was named after a white member, and of course there were some areas, and you find that the Nassau Street School or Columbus Street School, which is, as I said, was named for that. So there are, like I said, specks of positive contributions, but I feel that we've come a long way, but we still got a tiny bit way to go.
Cool, way to go. And you have some acknowledgements in this book. The purpose of this historic document is to provide a broad framework for the study and teaching of the history of the ethnic groups that exist in South Carolina. The groups chosen for the study were African Americans, the French, the Greek, the Scotch Irish, the Jews, and Native Americans. And the original objective was to plan and write a teacher syllabus to be implemented into 8th grade South Carolina history class. Why just 8th grade?
Well, you have to start from somewhere.
Okay.
And so, which means that when this was done, that not only has it done based on my feeling, but there was a wide group of groups that was there. And so, which means that if you look at the history of South Carolina, 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, because that's when they taught American history. So the consultants decided that it would be good to make sure that you combine American history and South Carolina history, because it was taught in the 8th grade at that time. But in 11th grade, they just had United States history. So you find that the leaders of the school district at that time got a grant. And I would be remiss if I would say that the person who gave money for this grant was none other than the United States senator at the time, which was Senator Strom Thurmond.
Right.
He fought very hard for this group. So to have the history, and then we were hired to write the history. And there were consultants, there were a number of advisory groups, and I made sure that the original persons who gave input into this, that they are listed. So that would say 8th grade, and that was the rationale for it. And which means that a lot of research was done. It took about 7 years for this to be done, and there were so many people that participated in the project.
Right.
Even though I was the lead dog, but there were so many people that it could not have been accomplished without their efforts.
And you all said this too. The intent of the study was and is to stimulate interest and concerns regarding human rights and to provide opportunity for members of the ethnic groups focused on to develop positive self-concepts with respect to the contribution of their ancestors to the state and to provide insight into the lives of immigrants who arrived early in America and South Carolina. Positive self-concepts. What are those?
Well, and I've been talking about it the whole time, and sometimes while you were talking, that, and being African American, I try hard to be more inclusive.
Okay.
And so, like you're talking, you haven't talked much about the Jews, like Meminger Auditorium, Christopher Meminger,
Right.
Secretary of State.
Sure.
So all of those areas, which means that some ethnic groups climb higher, for lack of a better word, than others, and have achieved financial status. And so when you're finding out that 1895 the Jews, migrated to the area, or can we point out to, Greeks, Father Trevelyan from the Greek Orthodox Church, or we can talk about many of these, the French Huguenots, and many of these areas who have, some of these groups have assimilated into American culture more easily than others. And so that's why a lot of emphasis is placed upon Indian, Native Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans, because a lot of the others have achieved, to some degree, more than others, racial equality, economic independence, voting privileges, the election of persons of their ethnic background, more so than others. But like I said, African Americans and Latino Americans somehow remain marginal when it talks about all of these other good things that America has brought to surface.
What have you learned about yourself now that you didn't know before publishing this book?
Nothing. No, I have a very high self-concept, as everybody knows. Miss Alston's superiority goes through the roof. But I mean, I was just kidding to go. But I've learned a bit of tolerance, more so, and as I grow older, and to listen to people more so than you have done, rather than talking all the time. And so I Google a lot and just learn.
Yeah.
And I try to learn something every day. And I think that probably to not be overconfident. A lot of people don't have that problem. And at the same time, to make sure that when you live, to do something for somebody else. In other words, I don't want my life to be in vain, to say that I've done something for someone else rather than my family. And there are a lot of people won't help you unless they know you. And I'm saying is to be ever vigilant, is to help those people that you don't know rather than just favor the ones that you do know. And at the same time, be fair, be courteous, and certainly to be respectful. Civility is on the downside of it, and it's to be civil to everybody and to respect the other person's point of view.
The ethnic history of South Carolina, South Carolina's contribution to American history. If you could republish this again, what chapter would you add now?
Well, I would, and I think that even though I didn't want to change the coloration, for lack of a better word, is to, and I thought about that, and things that have happened in South Carolina, and if I had to add a whole chapter on Emmanuel, I said, well, she's a member of the church. But, like Black Lives Matter, with, those kinds of organizations that have come up. And because most of the problems in America center around ethnic groups, I would say that being a politician, run for office, I try not to be too political, to talk about the political events. I probably would have paid more attention to, I didn't want to deal with the problems of America, just wanted to deal with the contributions. So even though this reflected a lot of it, and I am writing another book of a different hue, a different topic, but it would be about the contributions that people have made, particularly in other sections of the country. But here again, if I were to stick to South Carolina, I'd talk about the political images, talk more about the positive things that happen as a result of removing the flag, positive results that happen not only in Charleston, but in Dorchester County.
Sure.
What is happening in Columbia,
Right.
What's happening in Orangeburg,
Right.
What is happening in Sumter,
Right.
What is happening in other sections of the world, state, even though Charleston and Columbia has a tendency to dominate the politics of other areas. And I have to be very careful about it because today is Tuesday. I'm going to speak at the an area in another section. So I am busy talking about the contributions of others other than the ones in my immediate geographical sphere.
That's amazing. Well, Dr. Elizabeth Alston, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome back to Quintin's Close-Ups.
It has been my pleasure, Quintin. And for once, we're talking about a positive area without dealing with problems that infiltrate our lives. Thank you for your contributions to this great city, state, and nation of ours. God bless you.
Likewise, you're welcome.